some of us were embarrassed, if not frightened, but what appeared to be the return of the biblical giant called Goliath, who threatens the extinction of other countries. And may I say to the United States President, Mr. Trump, please blow your trumpet. Blow your trumpet in a musical way towards the values of unity, peace, cooperation, togetherness, dialogue, which we have always stood for and which are well written in our very sacred document, the Charter of the United Nations.
Well, that was Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe scolding U.S. President Donald Trump for his comments towards the Democratic People's Republic of Korea at the 72nd UN General Assembly last week. Welcome back to Talk Africa. We continue our discussion now into the outcomes of the meeting and Africa's representation there. And I still have my expert guest standing by in Johannesburg, Michael Sudakasa, CEO at the Africa Business Group. And joining us now from New York, Tiamiyu Arobani. He's the North American Bureau Chief for the News Agency of Nigeria. With me in Nairobi, Dr. Mustafa Ali is still here with me. Tiamiyu Arobani, I'll come off to you though, because those were quite forceful statements from President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. Do you get the feeling, though, that Africa's sentiments at the United Nations now are starting to get a voice?
Yes, whichever way you look at it, Africa is a very important continent, in the world, and also in the UN. And the voice of Africa, has become very powerful, Africa has 54 countries, and which is the largest continent represented on the UN. So when any resolution is going to be taken on the floor of the General Assembly, when Africa votes as a group, as a bloc, whether for or against, it tells a lot, on whether the resolution is going to pass or not. And you also have to understand the fact that Africa has had its own toll of a crisis. We know what is happening now in South Sudan. We know what is happening, in Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Africa does not want the world, where there's going to be violence again. We have had enough of violence. Right. And that is why everybody is calling for peace.
I want to take up that point, though, with Dr. Mustafa here in studio with me, because the crisis on the continent, as Tiamiyu is mentioning there, and President Mugabe did talk about that, and he actually looked at how much money was spent on military expenditure in 2016. He said $1.6 trillion was used in military expenditure as compared to $142.6 billion spent on overseas development assistance. Do you agree, though, with his assessment that the military expenditure has not necessarily translated into peace and security on the continent?
Absolutely, Beatrice. Absolutely. To spend, first of all, that kind of money on military expenditure is a pointer to the kind of world that we are in today. And nobody is going to manufacture arms and just, be content to keep them in the stores. They're going to use them. The British are using their arms through Saudi Arabia, bombing Yemen, and we see that being, the bombings being carried out on daily basis. What is happening in other places, conflicts that can be resolved through dialogue and talking. And when you look at the amount of money that is used for development, it's very little. And monies that are used to manufacture arms do not produce anything. It is just to go and destroy. And Mugabe was spot on there.
Dr. Mustafa, is it time, though, now that Africa looks for a different approach with its partners when it comes to peace and security issues on the continent, when it comes to military expenditure for peace and security issues on the continent? Is it time to relook at the approach?
Yeah, It is time that Africa evaluates the kind of partnerships that we have with some of the countries around the world with regard to our own security. There are those countries that have been interfering with the affairs of other nations. Libya, for example, UN Resolution 19, Security Council Resolution 1973 on the responsibility to protect. That was pushed so far to actually push for a regime change that led to the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, which are the countries that prosecuted that? It was the United States of America, Britain, and France. And no wonder now you see that China and Russia actually vetoing resolutions that wish to sanction Syria. Right. So it is up to African leaders, and they have to reevaluate those kind of partnerships that are not in the interest of the African countries.
Tiama, you were following this from New York, though. In terms of what you felt came out strongly about Africa, in terms of the resolutions, what stood out?
Yes, the resolutions at the United Nations, has always been that Africa vote in group. And you also have to understand the fact that Africa has had its own toll of a crisis. We know what is happening now in South Sudan. We know what is happening, in Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Africa does not want the world, where there's going to be violence again. We have had enough of violence, and that is why everybody is calling for peace. You can also see the statement of the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. He is saying diplomacy, should be the watchword now, in resolving the crisis in North Korea. Nuclear war is not something that Africa wants now. So there's the need to employ their diplomacy.
Michael, yeah. Just coming back to Africa's issues and Africa in focus, though, just how effective do you think that meetings at the UN have been for Africa? And moving forward, though, what should Africa put emphasis on going into the next year?
Well, I think that we go into the UN meetings, at least this year, we went into them with a lot that is unclear globally. The U.S. not supporting efforts toward climate change is a big challenge. The UK undertaking Brexit and pulling out of the EU, and that's going to be continuing, means that there's not clarity about either the UK relationship with Africa or the EU relationship with the continent. We are also at a point, and I think it was mentioned by one of the colleagues, that African participants at the UN General Assembly are also using that annual trip to lobby in other areas. There were a lot of meetings around diaspora engagement this year. Remittances have been noted as huge contributors from a financial standpoint to the continent, but there's also an effort to look at technical assistance, direct investment, and so you saw leaders traveling down to Washington, D.C., inviting stakeholders to New York to maximize the benefit of being in New York. There were also discussions about sectors of interest, like right. agriculture, where efforts were made. And again, the idea of public-private partnership is much stronger, and I think it will continue to be, because the UN as a vessel exclusively at this juncture is unstable, in large part because of, it seems like, the lack of commitment from the United States to support.
Right. Dr. Mustafa, do you feel that these meetings have been effective, and moving forward, where should Africa be putting their emphasis?
They have certainly yielded some fruits, Beatrice, but in my opinion, they are not the most effective meetings, and I still would like to see much more interests of the African people represented at the United Nations. Now, if the United Nations is not going to be reformed, and that's where we support Donald Trump on the reformation of the United Nations, then Africa is still going to get a raw deal. the Security Council of the United Nations is not demographically representative. There is no African country or Latin American country that sits there as a permanent member. They are always one of or two of the 10 non-permanent members. Now, the African leaders, with our own regional organizations, the Africa Union, IGAD, ECOWAS, SADC, they really have to work much, much harder to make sure that the interest of Africans are represented there as a bloc. And that is the only way Africans rather can get anything useful out of the United Nations.
Right, Tiamiyu Arobani, very briefly though, in terms of effectiveness for Africa's voice, did that come out?
Yes, I agree with the last speaker that we need a reformed Security Council. You know, this is the most important multilateral organization in the world. As the Security Council is composed right now, you know, it is not representative. You know, a United Nations that is you know, promoting democracy also need to be democratic. But the reform that the U.S. president is talking about, you know, we should not forget that he's not talking about reforming the Security Council. He's talking about administrative reform, cutting down on UN funding. You know, but now we need Africa to be represented on the Security Council. No matter what we say at the General Assembly is just a talk shop. You know, where real actions are taken is on the Security Council.
Right, Tiamiyu Arobani, we'll leave it there for the moment, and thank you all for joining us on the program. That's all we have time for this week, but thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Michael Tudekasa, CEO at the Africa Business Group. In New York, Tiamiyu Arobani, North American Bureau Chief for the News Agency of Nigeria. And with me in studio, Dr. Mustafa Ali. Thank you all for being on Talk Africa. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.